So K. Redfield Jamison is the author of what is now a classic memoir about manic depression, An Unquiet Mind, as well as the books Night Falls Fast, Touched by Fire, and most recently, Setting the River on Fire, about Robert Lowell, and not a biography, as she says, but a study of the interaction of genius and madness and Robert Lowell. And she is a professor of mood disorders and psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Our other presenter is Leslie Jamison, whose first book was the novel The Gin Closet, and who has since become a rising star of nonfiction and the essay by virtue of her two essay collections, The Empathy Exams and Make It Scream, Make It Burn, which recently came out. And most important for our purposes tonight, her brilliant book, The Recovering, about alcoholism and creativity. And she is a professor of writing and the concentration director of nonfiction in the writing program, School of the Arts, and my colleague and friend. Let me point out that their books are on sale and can be purchased right afterwards. But first we will have the order as follows. Kay Jamison will read for 10 or 11 minutes. And then Leslie Jamison will read for 10 or 11 minutes. And then I will moderate a discussion between the two of them. And then we will take questions from the audience. So, Kay, will you begin?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly honored to be presenting with my wonderful niece, Leslie Jamison, who is also an extraordinary writer. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be talking this evening about Robert Lowell, and I have two specific acknowledgments to make. The first is to his daughter, Harriet Winslow Lowell, who was kind enough to give me permission to track down his medical and psychiatric records, and who made herself very available to answer any questions that she could about Robert Lowell, as well as her mother, Elizabeth Hardwick. I am also particularly indebted to my husband, Tom Trail, who's here this evening, who's a professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins, who wrote one of the appendices in my book about the medical aspects and how the medical aspects of Robert Lowell's life wove together with his psychiatric history. It's always a fairly complicated thing when somebody has heart disease and a major psychiatric illness that can affect heart disease. He also was just wonderfully involved with the book in general. So this evening I wanted to talk about an aspect of writing and imagination and creativity that gets perhaps less acknowledgement, a discussion, than depression. I mean, I think most of us have a general sense of what depression is, what it feels like, if not in ourselves, with somebody that we know. Mania is a less known beast, but it's very actively involved in imagination and creativity, and indeed, the close to 200 studies that have been done about the relationship between creativity and mood disorders, the relationship tends to be with bipolar illness, where there's a history of mania as well, for a lot of reasons, which I'm really not going to get into. But one aspect of manic temperament and mania itself is a vastness of thinking, writing on a large scale, imagining on a really wide, huge canvas, as opposed to a very circumscribed one. Obviously, you don't have to be manic in order to have that kind of expansiveness of mind or imagination. Many people don't. But it is peculiarly related to the manic temperament to have that swinging for the fences. And why does that make a difference? Well, in the case of Robert Lowell, it made all the difference in the world because his work was really characterized that he would much prefer to invent and be original and fail than not to go for everything and change the game. He was an active participant in history. I mean, I think the fact that his delusions when he was manic were almost always around historic figures and figures of power, from Alexander the Great to Julius Caesar to great writers and so forth, was not unrelated to being capable, by everyone's account, of being able to imagine people in history. That when he talked about Caesar, people would say, his students would say, and his colleagues would say, Caesar was in the room. It wasn't just that he imagined Caesar, there was a bit of Caesar that was in the room. It was a very important part of his capacity to imagine. He also had an extremely bad form of manic depressive psychosis, which is what it was called at the time that he was hospitalized. He was hospitalized 20 times for acute mania. And he was 6'1", and that meant that he often was violent and therefore got brought to the attention of the police, put in a straitjacket. So this is not just kind of feeling grand and euphoric. I mean, he was very seriously ill. And then after each one of those manic episodes, he had months and months of depression. So this is a good part of his adult life. And one of the things I addressed in the book, actually, is something I'm very interested in, is the courage. How do you wake up in the morning and deal with that? How do you deal with the consequence of having done awful things when you're manic? How do you deal with terror of going mad again? So Lowell was a deeply serious man, deeply serious participant in the intellectual history of his times, the politics of his times, and of course poetry. His seriousness of purpose helped to frame his ambition, which was a wide capacity that spanned his expansive imagination and the manic illness that now and again catapulted him into delusion. Vaulting ambition had been his since childhood. Maddened grandiosities came to him later. A great canvas was necessary for Lowell's work, one that yoked a passion for greatness with the vastness of scale he admired in other writers such as Melville and Pasternak. Ambition tied the like-minded writers together, slung them upwards, broke some. The archangel loved heights, Henry Adams wrote in his book about Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. Standing on the summit of the tower that crowned his church, wings upspread, sword uplifted, the devil crawling beneath, St. Michael held a place of his own in heaven and on the earth. His place was where the danger was the greatest. No one could touch Henry Adams, said Lowell. He was the great, great New Englander. And like Adams' archangel, Lowell loved heights and did not turn his back on danger. Always he would hold a place of his own. He would set the river on fire. Lowell took faith in his ambition by looking to other writers. Melville and Hawthorne, he said, pour out more than the measure will hold. What wonderful dangers, errors, condescensions, and breathless abundance. Pasternak, Lowell, Hawthorne, Melville, Whitman, like Coleridge, all were habituated to the vast. They swung for the fences. They wrote to change the game. Lowell's habituation of the vast, his frictionless slides into history, and his comfort in the company of the great meant that he learned from great writers, historians, and epic heroes in a rare and immediate way. It placed him in an unbounded field under a high canopy, and it's a canopy under which he lived all of his life. Ambition, acute sense and longing for the place among the great, widens the imagination and emboldens it. Too little ambition narrows the emotional and imaginative field. It makes it less likely that risks will be taken and new territory seized. But ambition carries risk. It shares space with self-deception. It can cross into grandiosity and, more rarely, into madness. If one punches a hole in the sky, there can be no certainty about what is beyond. Lowell's behavior at the time he was committed to the Massachusetts Mental Health Center in 1957 provides an example of the open boundaries between poetic ambition, obsession, and clinical mania and grandiosity. Two facts were clear at the time of Lowell's admission to the hospital. First, Lowell was indisputably psychotic. Second, he had just written many of the poems that would make up Life Studies, one of the most influential books of poetry of the 20th century. The psychiatrist's admission note is particularly interesting in this light. She wrote, "There is undue preoccupation with greatness, almost a sense of mission in making a new contribution. He has a great need to be not only good, but to be unique amongst poets." He was obsessed with being among the great, she continued. He wanted to be a second Dante and actually thought he could be. And indeed, in the hospitals that Lowell was in for so many times over his life, he not only aspired to be ranked with Dante, but thought that he was Dante. At different times in different hospitals, he believed himself to be T.S. Eliot or Shakespeare or Homer, and revised their works accordingly. And indeed, his daughter, Harriet, recalls visiting him in a hospital and going through the wasteland, and Lowell was taking out every other line and saying, "Isn't this a much better poem now?" Ambition, imagination, and delusion reside in quite close quarters of the mind. To be in the grip of mania is to experience the unimaginable, try the unthinkable, do the unforgivable. Now and again, mania partakes in creating that which is astonishingly beautiful. But the past was always first and foremost in Lowell's mind, his ancestors, the history of the race. His mother had read to Lowell Hawthorne's great Greek myths to him when he was a child, and the stories fixed themselves to his imagination like limpets to a sea rock. "Sometimes when I'm trying to go to sleep," he said years later, "I can almost touch these people and talk to them. If I read some false modern retelling of the old stories, I say to myself, this isn't the way it happened. I was there." Hawthorne's fables are history to me, and just as much fact as the earth, the water, and the sky. Fables were history for Lowell, and history was fact. All were earth and water and sky. He took these imagined worlds into him. He drew upon them when he was sane, and he fell into them without a map when he was mad. I want to end. A lot of my book is about character and the hard work that any great writer puts into it, but certainly Lowell did under the circumstances of his life. An extraordinary setting about to try and undo the damage that he'd done when he was manic, but always to write and write and revise and revise. And so I want to just end with a personal tribute to Robert Lowell. When I was 17 years old and I had my first breakdown, my English teacher in high school said, I don't know how he knew what, and I don't know that he didn't know that much, but he knew something was wrong. And he said, he gave me 2 slim volumes of Robert Lowell's poems. And he said, "I think you might find these of interest." And I did. I mean, they just immediately went into my marrow, and they've stayed there since. And I've used it in teaching residents and medical students across the years. So I just want to end by saying a tribute to a great poet. My book about Robert Lowell, Setting the River on Fire, began in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1845 as Lowell's great-great-grandmother is taken by carriage to the McLean Asylum for the Insane. It ends in Cambridge in 1978 with Lowell's memorial service at Harvard. A foot of snow lay on the ground outside the church, and the wind blew to the bone. It was winter in Cambridge. Had the mourners looked up at the bell tower of the church as they left the service for Robert Lowell on that March day, they would have seen the bell that tolled for him. But they would not have been able to see the words carved into the shoulder of the bell. Words for the dead. They had been chosen by Lowell's cousin nearly 50 years ago when, as president of Harvard, he donated the bell to the college church. In memory of voices that are hushed, the bell read, in memory of the dead. The voices of the living could be hushed as well. Lowell's great-great-grandmother had lived a silent death in madness. Her son had said that only as much of her remained as the hum outliving the hushed bell. The poet's voice speaks for the dead, speaks for the hushed, the valorous. It signifies the hours, reminds of death. It gives depth and resonance to blithe times, solace in the dark. The bells cry, "Come, come home," Robert Lowell wrote. "Come, I bell thee home." Thank you.
So beautiful to hear that. Thank you. I just want to say a few words of thanks to Jana and Carol and Gavin for putting all this together, and Phillip for being willing to moderate our conversation. And more than anything, thank you to my beloved aunt for coming up to do this. I just have to say that for as long as I can remember, Kay has been teaching me what words can do. I would come and stay with her, and she would leave like 8 books of poetry on my bed and then leave me alone for a little while so that I could read and scribble and write. And watching the way that her books changed people's lives was just a huge part of my own young life. So it's wonderful to be here with you tonight, and thank you all for coming. So this book, The Recovering, is about a lot of things, but one of the things that it's about is the complicated triangle formed by addiction, creativity, and the possibilities of recovery. And I think when I was coming of age as a writer, I was very familiar with the mythology of the dysfunctional, drunk genius, and much less familiar with what might happen when someone tried to get better and what their art might become in that state of trying to get better. And one of the writers that I look at in exploring how all those factors collide is John Berryman. And I thought that I would read a couple of pieces of the book that are about Berryman for a few reasons. One of them is that Berryman and Lowell were friends and talked quite a bit, and maybe we can talk about this when we talk on stage, but about their respective reckonings with darkness and what it did to their art. But one of the things that I was really moved by, especially when I spent time with Berryman's archives in Minnesota, was the kind of ferocity and determination of his various attempts to get sober, and his deep desire to believe that there was a kind of creativity that could be possible in sobriety, even though he never stayed sober for good, and he never maybe completely wrote from that place, but he kept trying to get there. So I'm going to read a few pieces of the book that are about that. Through the course of his attempts to stay sober, Berryman took many personal inventories. 1. What has bothered me most about myself all my life? whether I would be a great poet or not. 2. What bothers me most about myself at the present time? Poverty of love for others. 3. What bothers me most about myself in relation to the future? Whether I can overcome this. No surprise, perhaps, that Berryman's final book of poetry was called Love and Fame. During the last 4 years of his life, he went to rehab 4 times, detoxed at hospitals, went to countless AA meetings, and even chaired one at a local prison, inviting the prisoners to have dinner at his house when they got out. One took him up on it. He read piles of AA literature. He filled out charts and checklists. Every one of his monthly inventories from Hazelden was full of check marks and X's. He put little crosses next to self-importance, dishonesty, and false pride. Next to resentment, he wrote, hurts oneself, always for the unchangeable. He underlined the immoral in immoral thinking. He was immersed in the so-called Minnesota model, what we now call rehab, in the heart of Minnesota, residential treatment in the land of 10,000 treatment centers. The AA first step that Berryman completed the first time he first arrived at St. Mary's Hospital in Minneapolis gives a sense of the wasteland his drinking had become. Wife left me after 11 years of marriage because of drinking. Despair, heavy drinking alone, jobless, penniless, seduced students drunk. My chairman told me I had called up a student drunk at midnight and threatened to kill her. Drunk in Calcutta, wandered streets lost at night, unable to remember my address, many alibis for drinking, severe memory loss, memory distortions, DTs once in Abbott, lasted hours, quart of whiskey a day for months in Dublin, working hard on a long poem. Wife hiding bottles, myself hiding bottles, wet bed drunk in London hotel, manager furious, had to pay for new mattress, lectured, too weak to stand, had to sit, lectured, badly prepared. Defecated uncontrollably in a university corridor, got home unnoticed. My wife said, St. Mary's or else. Came here. There's a palpable heartbreak not only in the devastation of Berryman's drinking, but in his surprising regrets. Not just shitting in a hallway, but also lecturing badly prepared. He was preparing better for recovery. Hence the piles of reading, the dutiful charts. In one fourth step, he made a list of his responsibilities. A, to God, daily practice, submission of will, gratitude. I agree, it's one of my few lifelong virtues, well-wishing others. B, responsibilities to myself, determine what I want, life, art, seek help, never deceive myself, look for the wonder and beauty. C, responsibilities to my family, cherish them, they look to me for love, guidance. D, responsibilities to my work, above all seek balance. Personal acclaim is the alcoholic's poison. E, responsibilities to AA. To God and AA, I owe my deliverance. At the bottom of the list, he wrote instructions to himself. Be careful how you live. You may be the only copy of the big book other people ever read. When Berryman started to consider writing a novel about recovery, he imagined a book that would function not as great literature, but as a 12th step. We tried to carry this message to alcoholics, bringing recovery to those who hadn't found it yet. He scribbled ideas for what this book might become. Make a book of these notes, useful 12th step work, probably hardly worked up at all, only expanded and glossed with some background on Hazelden and St. Mary's last spring. This wasn't another lyric dream song. It was something else, hardly worked up at all, not meant to be beautiful but useful. In considering his book, Useful 12-Step Work, Berryman was following the desire he'd articulated on his inventories to replace the ambition to be, quote, a great poet with a creative life committed to love for others. He thought of calling the novel Korsakoff's Syndrome on the Grave, but found he preferred I Am an Alcoholic. Like better, he wrote next to this simpler title. Eventually, he just called the book Recovery. He wanted to donate the profits, give half my royalties to who? Not AA, they won't take it. Perhaps just lend it privately to AAs in despair. Berryman kept his notes in a beige notebook labeled Recovery Notebook, stained with coffee. His life no longer ran on whiskey and ink, but on caffeine and graphite, less godly fuels. He wanted recovery to constitute an act of gratitude. In an early draft, he imagined his dedication. This summary and diluted account of the beginning of my recovery is devoted to the men and women responsible for it. The founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, physicians, psychiatrists, counselors, clergymen, psychologists, transactional analysts. One of the funny things about Berryman's archives was all these letters from his analyst saying, when are you ever going to pay me for our sessions? But Berryman was grateful. Group leaders inserted, nurses, orderlies, inpatients, outpatients, members of AA, and to its primary divine author. In the spring of 1971, less than a year before his death, Berryman taught a course at the University of Minnesota called The Post-Novel, Fiction as Wisdom Work. This was what he was attempting in recovery as well, something like wisdom work. By the time Berryman started working on his novel Recovery, he had come to see the notion that he needed to drink in order to write as a delusion. So long as I considered myself as merely the medium, arena for my powers, sobriety was out of the question, he wrote in 1971, in a handwritten note he later adapted for use in the novel. The even deeper delusion that my art depended on my drinking, or at least was connected with it, could not be attacked directly. Too far down. The cover had to be exploded off. After one of his admissions into detox, Berryman wrote a poem addressed to his fellow patients, Tyson and Joe. Take up outside your blocked selves some small thing that is moving and wants to keep moving and needs, therefore, Tyson, Joe, your loving. The poet teaches what he most needs to learn, and Berryman was constantly finding ways to recommit himself to the lives of others. In the margins of a grapevine, an AA magazine, next to one prompt, have I a personal responsibility in helping an AA group fulfill its primary purpose? What is my part? Berryman wrote, to listen. Next to, what is the real importance of me among 500,000 AAs? He wrote, 1/500,000th. There were 500,000 AAs for Berryman to love, every one of them moving. Recovery was about understanding himself as one tiny numerator, a blocked self, above the larger denominator of an entire community. I'll stop there. Thanks.
I wanted to begin by asking you, each of you notes a difficulty in writing the kind of book that you wrote. In your case, Kay, you talk about how mania invites a kind of sensationalism, and you cite Ian Hamilton's biography of Lowell as being unduly sensationalistic, although you covered much of the same territory, but in perhaps a more sympathetic way. So that was the problem that you had to overcome. And Leslie, you talked about how so many narratives of alcoholism are boring, repetitious. Readers feel that they've heard this already, and so you had to deal with this challenge of writing a book about this subject, knowing a certain skepticism on the part of some readers. So how did you each handle these challenges?
Well, I had a real concern about how do you portray unsympathetic behavior that is tied to aberrant mood and psychosis in a sympathetic way. This isn't easy to do, and it sounds like you're justifying somebody. And Lowell was the first person to say that he did truly awful things when he was manic. He really did. I mean, he was violent, he attacked people, he was eviscerating verbally to young people, and young poets. And I mean, he was really, and he had affairs and very public affairs and so forth. So it was awful. There's no way around it. On the other hand, he was, when he was well, hugely loved by almost everyone who knew him. Incredible loyal friends, loyal family, and was a generous man, a gentle-spoken person, a kind person who did all sorts of things. I mean, Elizabeth Bishop, for example, who was a great friend of Lowell's, said it was only after he died that she found out all the things he had done for her, financially, lining up posts and positions, because he'd never mentioned them to her. And so he was, I think that's a real problem. And so, for example, Tom and I have a colleague who's a pathologist, who's really a very empathetic man. And he said, well, it isn't just a case of people do when they're manic, they just do what they really want to do when they're well, but they give themselves the excuse to do it. And I said, no, I think it's more like delirium. If you're on a ward and somebody's delirious and they come at you, you're a nurse, and they come at you with a pair of scissors to go for your throat because they're paranoid and upset. You don't say that's a character aspect of the person who's delirious. You say the person's delirious, right? You don't hold that. This is very much the case with mania, and yet it's harder. And so the question is where character comes in and trying to describe it. What Ian Hamilton seems never to have been able to do, and it was very public. He was married to somebody who had severe bipolar illness. What he was never able to do was look at it from Lowell's point of view, his friend's point of view, and what did he try and do with the situation? Nobody signs up for mania, I can assure you. Nobody signs up for madness. Lowell didn't sign up for it. He was terrified of it. So you have only so many options. But it was a difficult aspect. But I think the aspect of character in modern psychiatry sort of disappeared a little bit. We talk so biologically that we forget there are people who struggle with these things.
Yeah, well, I mean, the question of sensationalizing is sort of the flip side of the writing challenge of, I guess, telling the boring or overly familiar version of the addiction story, which is to say that addiction, in a distinct but maybe related way to mania, also invites itself to, either vilify the one who's in the thralls of addiction and sort of acting from within that thrall, and also to sort of tell a sensational version of the story. And, one of the primary texts with Berryman that I was sort of writing against was this Time magazine profile of him. I mean, this is the kind of thing that would never happen now. It's like the big Time profile of like a...
Right, showing him drinking, yeah.
Yeah, that was, it was all these photos of him in a bar with his empty tumblers and, really hitting hard. That's where the whiskey and ink language comes from in the section I read, this idea that, he takes one fluid in and that fluid is whiskey and then the ink comes out, and that literally the addiction is sort of feeding the genius, or at the very least, like buffering this contact with intense psychic darkness in a way that's enabling the production of genius. But part of what I wanted to do, and I think this is kind of connected to that idea of having compassion for the one who's inside the experience, is to say this archetypal image of the genius poet, it's easy to forget within that mythos, like how much Berryman was suffering, that you could feel his liver through his skin because it was so big. And I wanted to do justice to a much more complicated version of Berryman, a version of Berryman that was in pain, a version of Berryman that wasn't just sort of throwing everything to the wind and drinking as much as he wanted, but actually wanted desperately to stay sober. I wasn't familiar with that part of him, but it's right there in his archives,
I mean, not just his archives. I love the last book, Love and Fame, and I think that it has a lot of self-mockery and humility in it. And one of the things that it seems to me that's true for Lowell and true for true for the autobiographical part of your book and true for Berryman, is this pull-down vanity theme of this need to go through a kind of humbling, let's say. And a kind of modesty, just as Lowell wanted to be hospitalized in a sense, and wanted to see himself as one among many in the wards, because it seems like writers, they start out wanting to be unique, and then in the case of Lowell, in the case of Berryman, and in your case. Trying to put aside originality is not the most important thing, but to feel more commonality with other people.
There's a beautiful quote in one of Berryman's biographies from a woman who was in rehab with him, where she could remember this constant struggle that he seemed to have between wanting to be just one of the people who was in rehab and constantly needing to assert himself. And, in his novel Recovery, his character, Alan Severance, who's an immunologist but is clearly Berryman, is constantly like speaking loud. He's trying to speak softly, but he ends up speaking louder than everybody around him. Like he's constantly in this kind of struggle about how pronounced his own voice is going to be. And this woman who had been in rehab with Berryman said, he wanted to let go of his desire for uniqueness, but it seemed that at the core of him, it was the only thing he thought made him worth anything at all. And that deep fear that if you kind of give up this aspiration to uniqueness, that you'll lose yourself entirely or lose your own edges, I think was a real fear for him, even as he had that deep hunger to be like a man among men in those spaces of recovery or in the spaces of hospitals.
And Lowell, it seems to me, went between grandiosity, identifying with Napoleon, and then a much more humbled state, wouldn't you say?
I don't know that humble would be the word. I would say a generous state and a kind state. I don't think he was ever humble. I think he was actually too honest in a way to be humble.
He knew he was special. He knew he was a genius. One of the things that you talk about with Lowell is this contrast between his puritanical constraint in his background and wildness. So these are like two poles between this holding back puritanical constraint and wildness, and Leslie, when you describe your own progression or regression, it's like on the one hand being raised to be a good girl, and on the other hand feeling like there was this other limitless wildness in you. Yeah. So
I'm a lot like Robert Lowell and a lot.
especially the genius part. Yeah. I guess one thing that interested me when you talked about at one point this yearning for transcendence that alcoholics have sometimes, especially alcoholic writers, and that you said that they were like dogs chained and barking and wanting this transcendence, and Kay, in your book, An Unquiet Mind, you talk about wanting to soar, to go upward, I asked this question as a Jewish writer, whether you think that Christianity has anything to do with this urge for transcendence.
I think perhaps only in the label, because I think at least experiences of mania, in many respects, like maybe 50% of people who get manic have euphoric, grandiose manias, and 50% have only the very paranoid, irritable, unpleasant manias. Turns out, with one of God's little ironies, a very good predictor of lithium response is whether or not you have euphoric manias, and those are the people who are least likely to take lithium. The reason they are often reluctant to take lithium is because they don't want that feeling. So, I mean, we know from long before Christianity, from the observations of the Greeks and the Chinese, that these states are communal states, that people, as they begin to get manic, the ones who get euphoric manias, get the sense of communal, just a transcendence, but as I say, long, long before any kind of Christian wording, it's just that sense of euphoria, being at one with the universe, you know, that kind of universal, it's just an extraordinary feeling. So who wouldn't want it? I mean, you know, I think that's one of the things that you have to deal with in treating people with bipolar illness. You can't just dismiss this and say, well, you know, take your lithium, it's great for you. You have to make a different kind of argument.
Yeah, because you mentioned that Lowell felt that at times he stopped taking his lithium, and he felt that it flattened him out in some ways. So
he actually stayed on his lithium pretty well. He got toxic at one point. Here in New York, when he was living in England, he'd come back to New York, and he ended up in delirium in a New York hospital, and they pulled him down on his lithium, and then he was wobbly for the rest of his life. I mean, for the next 2 years. But he was actually remarkably, he sang praise to lithium. He didn't have any great sense of romance about his illness. His illness had destroyed much of what he loved in life.
I think about another poet, James Schuyler, who wrote the book The Crystal Lithium, and Schuyler's poems, especially during this phase, they're so lucid. You know, it's the opposite of that Baudelaire idea of derangement of the senses. It's like he was so mad that he was so happy for every moment of lucidity, and he would write out of those moments of lucidity. You know?
Yeah. I mean, the kind of longing for transcendence, and in particular, how you were framing that particular ecstasy of mania as like feeling connected to something or feeling part of something infinite or sort of boundless is, I think it resonates in a couple of ways with the various longings for transcendence that show up in my own story here and in the stories of other writers that I was looking at. And I think the moment that you referenced where I describe this kind of booze-fueled yearning for transcendence as like a dog tethered to a pole, like barking at the sky, was a way of trying to get at this particular irony of getting drunk over and over again. I think I'm thinking a bit about Malcolm Lowry's Consul and Under the Volcano in that moment, but certainly it felt true for me as well in a less dramatic way than it did for the Consul. Like this sense of kind of that at first alcohol can promise this sense of like losing the boundaries of the self, or like getting loose or getting large or getting grandiose, but that it's like it's constantly actually yanking you back to a pretty degraded feeling of the self, where you're called back to the hangover the next morning, or you're called back to like a head that feels like stuffed with like little pieces of paper. I mean, you're not actually, you're constantly feeling like the booze made these promises that it's not keeping, and that's the rope that's keeping you tethered to the pole. And a lot of what was really moving to me in terms of the desires that, well, people in recovery and even authors in recovery would articulate is that recovery became sort of another means to a different version of that transcendence, of like particularly feeling part of something larger than yourself. And so when Berryman writes about the 500,000 AAs, I think he's trying to find a way back to that sense of expansion, or that sense of like joining up to something much bigger than he is. But I think what was hard for him about that desire for expansion was that he framed it to himself as he had to shrink himself smaller in order to join up with that larger thing, and that shrinking himself smaller wasn't something that he was ever fully able to do. Maybe related to what you said about Lowell was too honest to be humble, right? Like something in Berryman cried out against just being 1/500,000th, but maybe that same part of him could actually find that yearning to be part of something bigger if it hadn't been so yoked to that self-extinguishing.
And I think what's interesting is this wonderful correspondence between Berryman and Lowell, and incredible friendship after hospitalizations. They would write to one another. Berryman would have gotten out and then just made a complete idiot out of himself when he was manic, and he was feeling terrible, and Lowell would be well, and he would say, I know the feeling, I know the degradation, I know what you've been through, you know, come and visit, or whatever. But there's this incredible tenderness and the sense of the humiliation involved in what they'd done when they were manic, but this camaraderie for knowing what that kind of suffering was, and quite straightforward communication letters between the two.
Yeah, you also talk about Lowell writing to Ezra Pound, you know, and that interested me that he had a kind of a filial relationship to Pound, and he kept in touch with Pound, even though Pound also went off the charts sometimes, you know.
He went way off the charts sometimes, and he would take like friends, like he took Elizabeth Bishop down to meet him, and
Really?
He visited
in St. Elizabeth, or
in St. Elizabeth. He visited him fairly, not often, but remarkably often, given the circumstances. A lot of people completely abandoned him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Frost thought he should be killed, yeah, because he was a traitor.
Yeah, Frost's
Frost was
level of empathy for people.
he was a provocateur anyway, yeah.
Left a
Yeah.
little something to be desired.
So I think that in many ways, when you write about mania, you want to hold a brief for it to some degree. That is that society should recognize that if you were to purge all these people of mania, that some of their gifts would be muted in a way. That there's something to be said for mania, even though obviously it extracts a devastating price. Whereas I got the feeling after reading The Recovering that you definitely did not think that alcohol was necessary to be creative. So in a way, the two of you were dealing differently with these two problems.
I would say that I would never want to make a strong brief for anybody having bipolar illness, because anybody who's had it understands the pain and suffering that goes with it. On the other hand, I think there are so many studies now. I mean, way over 100
could you
studies
talk about that?
that show a very much elevated rate of people with a history of mania being disproportionately represented. And these are large population studies over hundreds of thousands of people and individual biographical studies. I mean, wide varieties of studies.
You said that writers were 10 times more likely to be classified as bipolar 1 than normal average.
That was a study from the Iowa Writers' Workshop, yes.
Yeah.
But I think that it's also important, if you pull it away from the concept of mental illness and you say temperaments, okay? So what we know from studies of temperaments in children, infants, adults is, first of all, temperament tends to be pretty steady across time. But if you do studies in a laboratory and you take young children in, and you can divvy these kids up, you know, you have like toys and you have an experimenter. There's some children who can't lose their mother fast enough, right? They run over to the toys, they explore, they are all over the experimenter, they're just happy as clams, they're what we call hail fellow well met extroverts.
Right.
Then there's some kids who are terrified of a new situation, cling to their mothers and so forth. You take these same kids several years later, you put them on a modified basketball court. The same percentage of like maybe 20% of kids that were at the Hail Fellow Well Mets start off, you know, going for the basket, and then after 2 or 3 times, they get really bored. and they want the long shots. They want to hit for the fences. And they run up and down the court, and they just have fun, and they take risks, and they love it. It's worth it to get that one long shot in. So we have this on 60 species at least, on foxes. There are 20% that are very conservative, don't take risks, another 20% that do. So this is very tied to the manic temperament. And the question is, do you really want to start that distribution in temperaments, the conservative and the risk-taking? It's true, if you're a fox and you're a risk-taker, you have more mates, you have more territory, and you're more likely to get run over. Right? So these are all the things. So the question is, temperament is very closely related to mood disorders, and so it gets to be quite complicated.
Do you think, you mentioned how writers tend to be represented much more in the manic studies, and
yes, depressive and mild manias, yeah.
I was wondering whether poets more so than prose writers.
Poets much more so mania, yeah.
Because of the flashes, whereas being a novelist is a very bourgeois profession because you need some steadiness to keep the plot going,
Well, you write some about Lowell's mania being associated with these very generative states, but also editing. I mean, the depression enabled some of the editing part of the process, which was sort of a grim version of editing, but also kind of resonated with me, that clarity and a certain kind of ruthlessness.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote across all mood states, but he generated a lot when he was manic, and then he revised, so it was almost unrecognizable by the time he got through.
I think one of the big questions that occurs in both your books is guilt, shame, and what is is this an illness or a vice? How much should these people be? Well, obviously, when you're dealing with certain substances, they're illegal, in America, and so it's partly an American problem, but of how you regard people who are either addicts, alcoholics, or suffering from manic depression. So, in a way, by your emphasizing character, you're also saying that it's not just, it can't be seen purely as a disease. There is a kind of will component in it as well.
I would say it's more that it's people with different characters get an illness. I mean, this is an illness, bipolar illness is an illness that has been described for thousands of years with very characteristic things, and people of all classes, all types get it. The question is, I think with character is, how far can you draw from it? For example, I spent a lot of time on college campuses because the age of risk for the onset of bipolar illness was 18 or so. And one of the things that I always tell the students is, look, it's really hard. Just get over the idea that this is not going to be really hard. Because if it isn't really hard, you haven't got bipolar illness, trust me. But it's what you do with it. And it's what you bring back from it. And you can bring back and help people, help yourself, make an interesting life, or not. So the character is really more in how you deal with it. I have no doubt whatsoever that this is a disease. I mean, it meets every criterion that we have for a disease. Yeah.
And you feel the same way about alcoholism?
Well, and I was going to say, I mean, and maybe this will tie together your previous question and this one, but around that idea of what you bring back from it. I guess I'm thinking about what you were asking about the book and thinking that where it comes down on the question of like, is there something creatively useful about addiction or drinking? And I think that one of the, sometimes with my students I talk about intellectual plot lines as a different kind of plot line that a work of nonfiction can have besides just like what happens. And I think one of the intellectual plot lines in this book is sort of tracing my own evolution from like coming of age on this like mythos of the great genius drunk, starting to really question that and thinking about how genius might not feel so contingent or have to feel so contingent on a certain kind of dysfunctionality, and how genius could also exist in states of recovery. But at a certain point in the book, I also try to call myself out on wanting to pretend as if you kind of can't pretend that there aren't these strong links also between addictive temperaments and creative genius, and that there's a fact that lots of people struggled with addiction and created beautiful, beautiful things out of that struggle, which comes back to that idea of bringing something back, which is not to say there are also lots of people who have struggled with addiction who didn't write the dream songs, but that idea that I almost realized that in especially in my own early sobriety, when I was so desperate to believe that sobriety could create the grounds for creativity as well, it was almost like I pushed away too forcefully any kind of link between addiction and genius or addiction and creativity, because I needed so badly to believe that like these days of like not drinking in Iowa cornfields could be full of something as well. And so I try to kind of come back to a dialectic place where I'm like, look, there are these incredible works of genius that come out of states of addiction, but it's not a prerequisite, or it doesn't have a monopoly on what production can look like, or what creative genius can look like, or what it can emerge from.
And you also say that sobriety at first was a total disappointment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I talk a bit about, I try not to like end there when I speak at events and I see the person in like the third row who's clearly like 30 days sober, and I don't want to leave them with just that message. But I do think there can be this way that, and maybe it gets back to the good girl thing you were talking about earlier, where I can strike, we all can, I think, strike these deals with the universe or deals with God or whatever it is we call it out there, where we say, if I do this, then I bet I'm going to get that in return, and if I get sober, then I bet, my relationship's really going to shape up and I'm finally going to finish this novel. And, sobriety was a disappointment in part because if there is a God, he doesn't work by my contract logic, so it wasn't like I was going to get all the things I had, thought I deserved in return.
You mentioned that the society regards male drunks who are writers different from female drunks, and the male drunks are people like Ray Carver and John Cheever and David Foster Wallace and Malcolm Lowry, Dylan Thomas, Jack London, and the female drunks were Jean Reese, Elizabeth Bishop, Marguerite Duras, Jane Bowles, So how does gender factor into all this?
Yeah, well, definitely one of the things that I want to think about, which really connects to the disease vice question as well, is how gender and race both really, really inflect how addiction gets seen. And that, in tracking the ways that, say, Raymond Carver and Jean Reese strike different silhouettes, or are allowed to strike different silhouettes in the literary landscape, I think it's like, Raymond Carver, at least when I was, at the Iowa Writers Workshop at 21, like, I barely processed that Raymond Carver had even gotten sober. Like, it was like Ray Carver drank here and here and here, and he was, always getting into trouble, and, the sense of him as like rough and dark and like really perched with his typewriter at the edge of the abyss was like a very available kind of archetype, and that I feel like somebody like Jean Reese doesn't quite get that archetype. She's often seen as like self-pitying, histrionic. Where were her kids? It's a different set of questions.
I wanted to ask you something about self-pity. Is there a role for self-pity in literature?
For sure, yeah. You've read my books, right?
Yes, exactly. So I wanted you to expatiate on that, yes. Yeah, there's this poem by Paul Verlaine called Gaspard Hasse Sings, and it ends with "Pray for the poor, Gaspard." And it's filled with self-pity. It's a beautiful poem, actually. So, one can defend self-pity instead of saying, in workshops they always say, you have to get rid of it, So, what do you think?
I think that it's somewhat an exaggerated affliction of our time, and I don't think it helps very many people anything. I think there certainly is a role for it. Obviously, any human emotion has a role in literature. But I think self-pity is a fairly irritating quality to be around. And one of the things that I miss is that kind of strong aspect of courage, and of writing about people who actually went through adversity and did it well and did it hard, and with all the suffering, and there may have been times of self-pity in it, but not just dwelling in the land of self-pity. I personally find that it's not something I want to read or be around, and I think there's a certain aspect that hopefully society's kind of moving beyond that, but there's just kind of been...
I feel like you're in transition because you have that essay in empathy exams for defending women's pain, and then in last week's Sunday Times book review, you talk about your disengagement from the sad lady narrative.
A great essay.
Oh, thank you. Say more. The
great essay.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about self-pity, but I think, one thing to say is that, and maybe this comes back to the language of like dwelling in or getting stuck in, which is often language that comes to mind when we think or talk about self-pity. I think the expressions of self-pity that I'm most engaged by as a reader are dynamic ones, where there's some sort of evolving relationship to self-pity, and not necessarily like a righteous conversion narrative where somebody is like in the thrall of self-pity and then finds their way out of it. But I think Jean Rhys is a great example where people criticize Jean Rhys's work for having too much self-pity in it, and then...
But those are good novels. Huh?
Right, and one way of defending her work, I think, like her second biographer, who was trying to defend her, said there's no self-pity in Jean Rhys's work, which seems like such a strange way to defend her work, because it's like, no, it's full of self-pity, but it's actually, to me, really interesting self-pity. So when you see, Sasha in Good Morning Midnight, like regarding her own pained face in the mirror as a kind of mask and saying, I could put a hat on this mask with a green feather, there's a lot of ironic self-awareness in that formulation that is both kind of accepting a certain state of pain and then thinking about how that pain also becomes part of self-presentation. And all of that is much more, to me, variegated and interesting than just embodying or indulging in self-pity. And I think my own, I do think of that Times essay as a kind of sequel to Grand Unified Theory of Female Pain, but I don't think of it as sort of turning completely on expressions of pain as limited or devoid of literary value. It's more really an articulation of, I think, my deepest interest is, and to some extent has always been, in forms of simultaneity. So how does pain exist alongside these other states, and how can works of literature find ways of articulating pain not as kind of the primary or only source of profundity, but as like one state constantly kind of rubbing shoulders with other emotional states. And it's in that rubbing of shoulders that something really kind of complicated and interesting can happen.
I wanted to ask you a technical question in a way, both of you. Your Lowell book is basically a work of research, and Leslie, your book has a lot of research in it. So how did you handle that in terms of your prose? Because you both have a very poetic and lyrical style, and you had to incorporate a lot of information, of research, and it was a very different challenge, I think, from writing An Unquiet Mind,
For sure. And I think that writing the book about Robert Lowell's the great privilege of my intellectual life. It was like waking up every morning for years having to tangle with this incredible genius. I mean, really, everybody's smart, and everybody around universities and everybody's smart, and the word genius is lobbed out about there. But he really was a genius, and it's like three-dimensional chess. And getting to know him was a privilege. Getting to understand him through his doctor's perspective and his friends' perspectives. So it was a lot of research, and some of it was the medical and psychiatric stuff, which is pretty straightforward. I mean, he didn't have an interesting disease in the sense that it was anything, and he just had a really bad form of a common illness, and it was, that part wasn't hard. Trying to understand his life and what he went through was hard, but I loved it. I loved almost every minute of it.
And you were the first one to have access to his hospital records, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Research? Did you cannibalize a PhD thesis to do this book? Or what was the relationship between your PhD thesis?
I love it. It's like you're citing a rumor that you heard somewhere on the street. Yeah. Yes, I did. At one point, I saw some of my students have heard this story, but at some point in the writing of the book, when I was working on this doctoral dissertation at Yale, I saw these Amazonian tree frogs at the Museum of Natural History here in New York, and there was a particular type of tree frog that would fertilize a set of eggs with one female frog, and then essentially convince a second female frog that he was going to fertilize her eggs as well, but then would steal them and feed them to the first set of eggs, to the first little set of baby frogs that he was nourishing. And when I saw that frog, I thought, oh, that's what I'm doing with my dissertation. I saw the truth of what I was up to, that I was going to use the dissertation to...
It doesn't sound at all like a PhD dissertation.
Yeah, I rewrote everything. I mean, a lot of the research was from that. But yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in the possibilities of not just the possibilities, I guess, but the deep truth of recognizing the personal baggage and investment that we bring to acts of research. So part of what I wanted to write about in this book was the way that I was going to these archives that I was visiting with intense amounts of emotional baggage. So when I visited Berryman's archives and looked at his 12-step work, I wanted to find some kind of proof that creativity was possible in sobriety. And the most interesting version of the book I could write about that was not a critical study of Berryman that feigned objectivity around those questions, but a version of the story that not only fessed up about my own investment, but told some of the story behind that investment.
I do want to invite questions from the audience, but I just want to ask one final question. I wanted to quote from Kay's book, An Unquiet Mind, where she was talking in a passage about her regret for not having children and how much she valued her nephews and her niece, and it says, talking about Leslie, my niece, considerably younger, is now 11, and having already won a national writing award, is very determined to become a writer. One often finds her curled up in a chair, scribbling away, asking about words or people, tending to her many and various animals, or leaping mouth first into a family discussion to defend her point of view. She is fiery, sensitive, original, and disconcertingly able to hold her own against a very vociferously articulate pack of older brothers, parents, and sundry other adults. So what I'm really asking is, how did the two of you feed off of each other as writers and take and console each other?
Yeah, well, I was starting to speak to this a little bit. I mean, for my side of things, I just adored Kay from the very beginning, and I think we always had this sense of a deep bond and connection that was about a lot of things, but certainly one of them was this love of language and what it could do. And so, even before I was sort of aware of Kay as a writer, I was aware of her as just this deeply imaginative human being who loved poetry, who wanted to give me poetry. I have an early memory of being at Hamburger Hamlet, and Kay, who often gets cappuccinos, used the foam from her cappuccino to make a snowman on the table, and I thought it's so amazing that adults can live in the world in this way, making foam snowmen on the tables. And so there was this sense of vitality and imagination and just great love and joy that was kind of infusing into me from an early age. And then there was this sort of deepening level in her influence once I read her work and started to really feel the ways that her work was not just like changing people's lives, but saving people's lives. The idea that you could put books into the world and do that, give that gift to people, was really powerful for me to see when I was growing up.
And you, when you first started reading Leslie's books?
I was staggered. I mean, I didn't start writing actually until I was really long after, about the time I became a full professor. In medical school, you don't get very many advancement points for writing books, I can assure you. And so my writing had consisted of like a 1,400-page book on bipolar illness, more than anybody in his right mind ever wanted to know about, everything from neuroimaging and clinical and so forth. So I didn't really write until much later, and because of my illness, I was very reluctant to get too personal. I always felt like I had to be much more controlled in my writing than my colleagues would ever feel like they had to be. So in a way, Leslie and I got into writing in a funny sort of way. I mean, other than scientific and clinical writing. But, and when I read, I would say it was not so much Leslie's book, so that certainly was true, that, I mean, just incredibly impressed, but was her stories when she was a young girl, just incredibly full of emotion and observation and humor and just wonderful stories that were just not like most kids' stories. And so I think, and
You got a preview.
I got a preview. I was privileged to get a preview.
So let's open it up to questions or comments from the audience, and there will be people wandering around and handing out torches.
Hello, thank you for this wonderful event. I have a question for you, Dr. Jamison. In An Unquiet Mind and in Setting the River on Fire, you really reveal the complexities and validate the characters of both subjects, of yourself and of Robert Lowell. And I'm wondering what you think is needed in today's mental health narratives.
Well, it's very interesting. I think one of the things that's happening is people, literally, there are a lot more mental health narratives. So I think overall that's a really great thing because people are much more aware. They feel less threatened in publishing them, that they're going to lose their jobs or anything. I mean, when I wrote mine, I was very concerned about losing my job. I was very concerned about losing my hospital privileges, losing my license. I mean, the very kind of real aspects of things. And I think now it's a more tolerant and educated world. However, the reality of mental illness in this society is that, you know, yes, there's stigma, and stigma is terrible, but the access to care is really just completely awful and unforgivable. And so I can say to people, you know, they say, well, I'm on X drug and so forth, and I'm still not well after 18 months. I can say, well, you know, if you're not getting well at the rate you'd like to feel like you should be, get a second opinion, fully aware that most people in the audience can't afford a first opinion. So that is just from square one, you know. And there are a lot of things that people can do to inform themselves. And there's a lot of literature and on the internet, you know, and a lot of good things available. And there are a lot of good doctors available. But there are a lot of not so great doctors, and it's primarily access. I mean, you know, we have a months and months waiting list at Hopkins, you know. It's just, so if you've got an emergency, you know, it's so that the reality in this day and age is, I think, as much a political one as a medical one. We can treat these. I mean, the issue is not whether or not bipolar illness and depression can be treated, because they can be, and they can be treated really effectively. And people can absolutely get back, compete, get back into the fray, love, work, and so forth. The problem is, how are you going to get good care? And that is essentially a political question.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
First of all, thank you for being here. There's a lot of art educators here, a lot of artists that believe that art saves lives, and I believe that. We taught Kate's work, Touched by Fire, at the Art Institute of Chicago since 1996, and so it was just part of a class that dealt with things we might think about if we want to be artists. And I always had a line of kids outside my classroom afterwards wanting to know what else they could read. What's wonderful about that work is that it took away the guilt, shame of being different. And that's what a lot of people really wanted. And then Leslie's work, Berryman's such a great choice, really allowed us to look at a more sophisticated way of joining AA, if you want to know the truth. It gets to the point where you can't even get varieties of religious experience, the reading list, because it hasn't been approved. But anyway, what I was going to ask is, there's a relationship between alcoholism and manic depression, and it gets confusing. You don't know if you get manic and then you start to drink, or if you start to drink and then you get manic, and that's very interesting. And if you notice, there's a lot of interest in the artistic community to what you guys are doing, so thank you for your work.
Sure, there is very definitely a significant correlation. So 60% of people who have bipolar 1, the classical severe form of bipolar illness, history of mania and depression, have a history of alcohol and or other substance abuse. So it's a huge problem. The question is, how do you make the differential between
Right.
if you're 18 years old and you've been drinking or in this day and age, using a lot of marijuana, are the mood symptoms because of the substance? What brings on what? And so that's where the fact that we know a lot about the illness comes in. And we know that it's a highly genetic illness, runs in families. So one of the things that anybody's taught to do is take a very thorough family history, So that's kind of minimal level. What symptoms first occurred? And as it turns out, in natural history, by and large, the symptoms of mood disorder predate the symptoms of depression. But what we also know is you have to treat both aggressively. You can't just treat the mood disorder without treating the substance abuse or alcohol problem, and you can't just treat the substance abuse difficulty. And so one of the problems that used to be with AA is that we would refer patients to people in AA groups because we thought it was helpful, but people in AA didn't believe that people should be taking psychiatric medications. Now, times have really changed and people are much more sophisticated, but that used to be, it would just completely undercut your clinical work. On the other hand, you didn't have that many options for how to treat people with things. But I think it's a much more sophisticated world now, and I think people are. But it's the arts community, we spent a lot of time at Hopkins on dealing with students from Peabody Conservatory and trying to educate them and bringing in various musicians and so forth, because they're a very high-risk group. So if you look from public health point of view, music students and students in the arts are actually at a higher risk for suicide, higher risk for depression, and you want to be able to just talk to them and encourage them to get treatment when they need it. It's also true for doctors, I might add.
Right.
Much higher suicide rate.
Go ahead. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between creativity and borderline personality disorder.
It hasn't been studied that I know of. There's some overlap in between borderline personality disorder and milder forms of bipolar illness, where you have a lot of affective mood lability, impulsiveness, and so forth. And that's a group that, again, it's really important to get the diagnosis right because the treatments are very different. So to the extent that that overlaps, then there's probably a relationship. I don't know of any single study that's actually looked at that. By and large, autism is looked at, depression is looked at, bipolar illness, and schizophrenia, and those tend to be the major groups.
Yes.
Hi, I want to talk a little bit I wanted to ask you about dual diagnosis, which you've touched upon. But what I'm interested in is, can you really have addiction, alcoholism, substance abuse, and not have depression, OCD, bipolar? Is there something that's just straight addiction without a mental disorder?
Yes. And again, that has a stronger genetic component than some of the other substance abuses, and more often in men than in women.
Yeah, we have a question over there, I think, yeah.
I'm so intrigued visualizing this situation the study you referenced with people who are like more free-spirited on the basketball court after having been like relatively, more free-spirited toddlers. But I wonder though, can that be called temperament? Those like early manifestations of outgoingness or shyness, and could it actually just be about attunement with the mother? Could it be like attachment trauma and not personality?
Well, it can always be a combination of things, but temperament has a very strong, again, heritable component to it. So that if you raise identical twins apart and you test their temperaments, there's a very high correlation between identical twins, even though the parents that raised them are different. So, and temperament, again, tends to obtain over time. It's not that there aren't a lot of exceptions. And this is also true in octopuses. It's true in dogs. It's true in cats. It's true in pigs. I mean, it's been studied in a lot of species. So it's not that there may not be the kind of attachment problems in other species, but they aren't the sort of things that we look at in quite the same sort of way. So, I mean, temperament's complicated, but it's one of those very interesting things that I think we don't study nearly enough. Terribly important to society, to individuals, to families, to life in general.
We have time for a few more questions.
I'm over here.
Yeah.
My question is about seeking treatment as a creative person, and whether or not either of you ever experienced any fear that if you invested a lot of energy into recovery that you might lose something consequential in terms of being able to produce art?
I think this is a frequent idea, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I did feel that, and that fear, and one of the really powerful things about doing all this archival research was just seeing how common that fear is. You know, I see Dennis Johnson articulating that fear, see David Foster Wallace articulating that fear, see John Berryman articulating that fear over and over again. And certainly, like, you know, in my own experience, it wasn't something, and we talked about this a little bit, it wasn't something so simple as feeling it instantaneously, either proved true or disproven. Early sobriety was hard for me in a lot of ways. I did it twice, so it got to be hard twice. And one of those was certainly that it wasn't, you know, I can remember, you know, going to meetings and being in coffee shops at night trying to write, because that was, you know, looking at the bars where I had used to, you know, get drunk and thinking, right, this is supposed to be the part where I am creative even though I'm sober, and I'm sort of like proving that fearful self who was in that bar a year ago wrong. And it wasn't so easy as that. But yeah, I mean, I've certainly found that my creative life feels, again, for me, it feels much more expansive and much more interesting and much more generative now, you know, 10 years into sobriety than it did 15 years ago. So, yeah, but those fears are real, and it was really consoling to see them show up over and over and over again. And also really consoling to see, like, Dennis Johnson say, it's so much more exciting, the stuff that I'm writing sober, you know, because I could believe in Dennis Johnson, like, long before I could believe in myself, yeah.
I think that's all we have time for, but if you have more questions, why don't you buy a book and talk to our two guests, and I'm sure they'll be happy to sign books and answer.